Good afternoon. I hope it's nice and sunny wherever you are. I wanted to read this book, William James, The Variety of Religious Experience. This is a series of lectures that William James gave, and then they became a book. And I got on this because I started reading Ross Dohat's Believe. I'm sure that's not how you say his name. That's how I say his name. It might be a little bit wrong. He's the New York Times columnist, and he's writing fresh from the public library today. So this is a very recent book. I'm sure other people have talked about it. He's writing, and it's weird what he's doing. He's giving people this, he uses the word blueprint to go from, and at the beginning of the book, he's in conversation with new atheists. He's in conversation with sort of Karen Armstrong's response to new atheists. This is all the way back in like 2006. And he says that there's a lot of people, and I don't completely disagree with this, but I don't see it exactly the way he sees it. He says there's a lot of people who he thinks are like uncomfortable agnostics. And he wants to give them this avenue and show them that belief is like a reasonable option. So I see this move being made a lot. And he's got all sort of the most recent kind of people on his, he's got Dreher, he's got just a ton of like the who's who that he's kind of in conversation with, and I also see Jordan Peterson in this move, which is very interesting how it is in conversation with the new atheists. This move towards the reasonableness of religious belief, and the thing about Karen Armstrong is interesting because he's talking about this dichotomy between belief and practice, and he says he doesn't want to sell people short with this fake it till you make it, or this. So I'm really interested to see sort of what he says at the end. He talks about his own Catholicism, and he calls himself a conservative Catholic. But he gives some very interesting biographical details about, well, he was raised Episcopalian, and then also really got into, I don't know if he says Pentecostal, but one of the holiness traditions. And he talks about just all sorts of interesting experiences. And so anyway, he's talking about his religious conversion and giving a blueprint for that. So I wanted to go back to the beginning. I think of James as sort of the beginning of scholarship on this. One of the more important voices, classical voices of sort of the academic study of conversion or whatever, maybe is sort of how I'm thinking about him. So he gave these lectures, and I don't know, I was just a little bit bored, and it's relevant to my research question, so I thought I would read it on my YouTube channel for fun. So here we are, Lecture 8, The Divided Self in the Process of Its Unification. I chose this chapter because I was reading it, and I did think it sounded pretty relevant to some of the conversations that I've been seeing. So he begins, the last lecture was a painful one, dealing as it did with evil as a pervasive element of the world we live in. At the close of it, we were brought into full view of the contrast between the two ways of looking at life, which are characteristic, respectively, of what we call the healthy-minded, who need to be born only once, and of the sick souls, who must be twice born in order to be happy. The result is two different conceptions of the universe of our experience. In the religion of the once born, the world is a sort of rectilinear or one-storied affair, whose accounts are kept in one denomination, whose parts have just the values which naturally they appear to have, and to which a simple algebraic sum of pluses and minuses will give the total worth. Happiness and religious peace consist in living on the plus side of the account. In the religion of the twice-born, on the other hand, the world is a double-storied mystery. Peace cannot be reached by the simple addition of pluses and eliminations of minuses from life. Natural good is not simply insufficient in amount and transient. There lurks a falsity in its very being. Cancels as it all is by death, if not by earlier enemies. It gives no final balance. It can never be the thing intended for our lasting worship. It keeps us from our real good, rather, and renunciation and despair of it are our first step in the direction of the truth. There are two lives, the natural and the spiritual, and we must lose the one before we can participate in the other. In their extreme forms of pure naturalism and pure salvationism, the two types are violently contrasted. Though here, as in most other current classifications, the radical extremes are somewhat ideal abstractions, and the concrete human beings whom we oftenest meet are intermediate varieties and mixtures. Practically, however, you all recognize the difference. You understand, for example, the disdain of the Methodist convert for the mere sky blue, healthy-minded moralist. And you likewise enter into the aversion of the latter to what seems to him the diseased subjectivism of the Methodist, dying to live, as he calls it, and making a paradox and the inversion of natural appearances the essence of God's truth. There's a footnote here, I'm not going to read it. The psychological basis of the twice-born character seems to be a certain discordancy or heterogeneity in the native temperament of the subject, an incompletely unified moral and intellectual constitution. Homo duplex, writes Alphonse Daudet. The first time that I perceived that I was two was at the death of my brother Henry. When my father cried out so dramatically, "He is dead, he is," well, this got gruesome real fast. So while my first self wept, my second self thought, how truly given was that cry, how fine it would be at the theater. I was then 14 years old. This horrible duality has often given me matter for reflection. So he's still in this anecdote. Okay. This terrible second me, always seated. Well, so he's giving this example of the twice-born character. Recent works on the psychology of character have had much to say upon this point. Some persons are born with an inner constitution which is harmonious and well-balanced from the outset. Their impulses are consistent with one another. Their will follows without trouble the guidance of their intellect. Their passions are not excessive, and their lives are little haunted by regrets. Others are oppositely constituted and are so in degrees which may vary from something so slight as to result in a merely odd or whimsical inconsistency to a discordancy of which the consequences may be inconvenient in the extreme. Of the more innocent kinds of heterogeneity, I find a good example. This is boring. So he's quoting this woman, Mrs. Annie Bessette's autobiography. I have ever been the queerest mixture. I'm not going to read this. This is long-winded. When does he get to the good stuff? I skimmed this over. There was good stuff. Now, in all of us, however constituted, but to degree, the greater in proportion as we are intense and sensitive and subject to diversified temptations, and to the greatest possible degree, if we are psychopathic, does the normal evolution of character chiefly consist in the straightening out and unifying of the inner self. The higher and the lower feelings, the useful and the erring impulses, begin by being a comparative chaos within us. They must end by forming a stable system of functions in right subordination. Unhappiness is apt to characterize the period of order-making and struggle. If the individual be of tender conscience and religiously quickened, the unhappiness will take the form of moral remorse and compunction, of feeling inwardly vile and wrong, and of standing in false relations to the author of one's being and appointment of one's spiritual fate. This is the religious melancholy and conviction of sin that have played so large a part in the history of Protestant Christianity. The man's interior is a battleground for what he feels to be two deadly hostile selves, one actual, the other ideal. As Victor Hugo makes his Mahomet say, all right, this is in French. wrong living, impotent aspirations. What I would, that do I not, but what I hate, that do I. As St. Paul says, self-loathing, self-despair, an unintelligible and intolerable burden to which one is mysteriously the heir. Let me quote from some typical cases of discordant personality, with melancholy in the form of self-condemnation and sense of sin. St. Augustine's case is a classic example. You all remember his half-pagan, half-Christian bringing up at Carthage, his immigration to Rome and Milan, and his adoption of Manichaeism and subsequent skepticism, and his restless search for truth and purity of life, and finally how, distracted by the struggle between the two souls in his breast and ashamed of his own weakness of will, when so many others whom he knew and knew of had thrown off the shackles of sensuality and dedicated themselves to chastity in the higher life, he heard a voice in the garden say, Summe lege, take and read, and opened the Bible at random, saw the text, not in chambering and wantonness, etc., which seemed directly sent to his address, and laid the inner storm to rest forever. Good for him, I guess. Augustine's psychological genius has given an account of the trouble of having a divided self which has never been surpassed. Oh, good. We're going to get a nice quote on this. The new will, so I guess this is Augustine, it doesn't really say, but the new will, which I began to have, was not yet strong enough to overcome that other will, strengthened by long indulgence. So these two wills, one cold, one new, one carnal, the other spiritual, contended with each other and disturbed my soul. I understood by my own experience what I had read, flesh lusteth against spirit, and spirit against flesh. It was myself indeed in both the wills, yet more myself in that which I approved in myself than in that which I disapproved in myself. Yet it was through myself that habit had attained so fierce a mastery over me, because I had willingly come whither I willed not. Still bound to earth, I refused, O God, to fight on thy side, as much afraid to be freed from all bonds as I ought to have feared being trammeled by them. Thus, the thoughts by which I meditated upon thee were like the efforts of one who would awake, but being overpowered with sleepiness is soon asleep again. Often does a man, when heavy sleepiness is on his limbs, defer to shake it off, and though not approving it, encourage it. Even so, I was sure it was better to surrender to thy love than to yield to my own lusts. Yet, though the former course convinced me, the latter pleased and held me bound. There was not in me to answer thy call, awake, thou sleeper, but only drowsy words. Presently, gasp, presently. Wait a little while. But the presently had no present, and the little while grew long. Sounds like anybody trying to write a dissertation. For I was afraid thou wouldst hear me too soon and heal me at once of my disease of lust, which I wished to satiate rather than see extinguished. Okay, the Orthodox tell me about this. For I was afraid thou wouldst hear me too soon and heal me at once of my disease of lust, which I wished to satiate rather than to see extinguished. With what lashes of words did I not scourge my own soul? Yet it shrank back, it refused, though it had no excuse to offer. I said within myself, come, let it be done now. And as I said, yet I was on the point of the resolve. I all but did it, yet I did not do it. I all but did it, yet I did not do it. And I made another effort and almost succeeded, yet I did not reach it and did not grasp it, hesitating to die to death and live to life, and the evil to which I was so wanted held me more than the better life I had not tried. Ooh, okay, so that's from Confessions, book 8. Totally abridged from like 5 different chapters. There could be no more perfect description, back to James here. There could be no more perfect description of the divided will when the higher wishes lack just that acuteness, that touch of explosive intensity, of dimogenic quality, to use the slang of psychologists, so uppity, William James, that enables them to burst their shells and make eruption efficaciously into life and quell the lower tendencies forever. In a later lecture, we shall have much to say about this higher excitability. Okay, all right, so now we're getting to the juicy stuff. I find another good description of the divided will in the autobiography of Henry Alline, the Nova Scotian evangelist. I'm sure we've all heard of him. Of whose melancholy I read a brief account in my last lecture. The poor youth's sins were, as you will see, of the most harmless order, yet they interfered with what proved to be his truest vocation, so they gave him great distress. I was now very moral in my life. So this is Henry Alline, the Nova Scotian evangelist. I was now very moral in my life, but found no rest of conscience. I now began to be esteemed in young company, who knew nothing of my mind all this while, and their esteem began to be a snare to my soul, for I soon began to fond of carnal mirth, though I still flattered myself that if I did not get drunk, not curse, not swear, there would be no sin in frolicking and carnal mirth, and I thought God would indulge young people with some, what I called simple or civil recreation. I still kept a round of duties and would not suffer myself to run into any open vices, and so got along very well in time of health and prosperity. But when I was distressed or threatened by sickness, death, or heavy storms of thunder, my religion would not do, and I found there was something wanting, and would begin to repent my going so much to frolics. But when the distress was over, the devil and my own wicked heart, with the solicitations of my associates and my fondness for young company, big wink here, that's not written, but were so strong allurements, I would again give way. And thus I got to be very wild and rude. At the same time, kept up my rounds of secret prayer and reading. Okay, so he's frolicking in private, but in public, but praying in private, be in the closet, like they say. I recommend this recipe. It's raspberries from my garden, lemonade, and club soda. Okay, so he's having a good time, but praying in the background. But God, not willing I should destroy myself, still followed me with his calls and moved with such power upon my conscience that I could not satisfy myself with my diversions, and in the midst of my mirth sometimes would have such a sense of my lost and undone condition that I would wish myself from the company. And after it was over, when I went home, would make many promises that I would attend no more on these frolics, and would beg forgiveness for hours and hours. But when I came to have the temptation again, I would give way. No sooner would I hear the music and drink a glass of wine, but I would find my mind elevated and soon proceed to any sort of merriment or diversion that I thought was not debauched or openly vicious. But when I returned from my carnal mirth, I felt as guilty as ever, and could sometimes not close my eyes for some hours after I had gone to bed. I was one of the most unhappy creatures on earth. You know, this is giving me the AA vibes. Anyone who talks about AA, I feel like. Okay, sometimes I would leave the company, often speaking to the fiddler to cease from playing as I was tired, and go out and walk about, crying and praying, as if my very heart would break, and beseeching God that he would not cut me off, nor give me up to the hardness of heart. Oh, what unhappy hours and nights I thus wore away. When I met sometimes with merry companions and my heart was ready to sink, I would labor to put on as cheerful a countenance as possible, that they might not distrust anything, and sometimes would begin some discourse with young men or young women on purpose, or propose a merry song, lest the distress of my soul would be discovered or mistrusted, when at the same time I would then rather have been in a wilderness of exile than with them or any of their pleasures or enjoyments. Thus, for many months, when I was in company, I would act the hypocrite and feign a merry heart, but at the same time would endeavor as much as I could to shun their company. Oh, wretched and unhappy mortal that I was! Everything I did, wherever I went, I was still in a storm, and yet I continued to be the chief contriver and ringleader of the frolics for many months after. It's a clown, a sad clown. Though it was a toil and torment to attend them. But the devil and my own wicked heart drove me about like a slave, telling me that I must do this and do that, and bear this and bear that, and turn here and turn there to keep my credit up and retain the esteem of my associates. And all this while I continued as strict as possible in my duties and left no stone unturned to pacify my conscience, watching even against my thoughts and praying continually wherever I went, for I did not think there was any sin in my conduct when I was among carnal company, because I did not take any satisfaction there, but only followed it, I thought, for sufficient reasons. But still, all that I did or could do, conscience would roar day and night. St. Augustine and Aline both emerge into smooth waters of inner unity and peace, and I shall next ask you to consider more closely some of the peculiarities of the process of unification when it occurs. Okay, so James is pointing out this process. That's important. This process of getting towards what he's calling unification. So we got these two minds or whatever. He doesn't call them minds. Two selves, I guess. The divided self, the flesh and the spirit, or whatever we're going to call it. He's saying, oh, there's a process toward unification. Wild stuff. Okay, so let's see his evidence for the process, I guess, and what it gets to. It may come gradually or it may occur abruptly. It may come through altered feelings or through altered powers of action, or it may come through new intellectual insights or through mystical experiences. However, we shall later have to designate them as mystical. However it come, it brings a characteristic sort of relief. And never such extreme relief as when it is cast into the religious mold. Okay, I'm reading this and I'm asking myself, is this true in the stories of the people that I've heard? Happiness. Religion is only one of the ways in which men gain that gift. Easily, permanently, and successfully, it often transforms the most intolerable misery into the profoundest and most enduring happiness. But to find religion is only one of the many ways of reaching unity. And the process of remedying inner incompleteness and reducing inner discord is a general psychological process, which may take place with any sort of mental material. And need not necessarily assume the religious form. In judging of the religious types of regeneration, which we're about to study, oh dear God, how long does he go on for? Okay, well, there's 5 or 6 more pages of this, and he's got more examples, but I think we got the gist of it, and we'll just skip to the conversion chapter, unless there's something really interesting in the rest of this. Okay, cool.